Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's the final session of today and of the entire China Forum. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sohn. I am, if you see on my name card, it's the Korea International Broadcasting Foundation. It's actually Arirang TV. For our Chinese colleagues, I explained that it is the Korean version of CCTV News, but with more culture and less money. So that's sort of who we are. I am very happy to be here. My training is journalist in background, so hopefully this final session will be able to delve into some issues that really sort of not only encompass what we talked about in the last couple of days, but sort of try to get some insights into what lies ahead for Korea and South Korea and China. Now, I just want to give a brief introduction to our extinguished panel of discussants here today. And I just want to start at my left with Dr. Park Taeho. He is South Korea's trade diplomat, in a way. He is the Minister of Trade at the Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. But he is an economist by training, and he has taught at both prestigious universities, both in South Korea and the United States. Besides him is Dr. Vasily Mikheev. Yes, great. He is the Vice President of the Institute of World Economy and International Relations, IMEMO, at the Russian Academy of Sciences. His background includes a number of posts that are related with East Asia, but what caught my eye was that he was the first secretary of the Russian embassy to North Korea from 1981 to 1984, which was a long time ago, but an important time. So he brings a Russian point of view to our discussion. Besides him is Dr. Douglas Paal. He is the Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is from the United States, but his expertise, including Asia, is that he also served as the unofficial U.S. representative to Taiwan. But he's also was the director of Asian Affairs at the National Security Council staffs of both President Reagan and President George W. Bush between 1986 and 1993. And last, but of course, definitely not the least, we have General Pan. He explained that it was a Chinese version of Secretary General Pan, but he's a senior advisor to the China Reform Forum and also the director of the Research Institute for Strategy and Management at the Central University of Finance and Economics in China. He brings a defensive perspective, possibly to Korea and to Korea and China, because he has also been a research fellow, deputy director, and director at the Institute of Strategic Studies of the National Defense University. So, with that in mind, we will launch again and head with our final panel. But this is what happens when you put a journalist in charge. Because of pressure from my journalist colleagues and my personal curiosity, we'll start by asking each panelist to address a following question about the elephant in the room, about North Korea's launch of the rocket this morning. Journalists, get your pen ready. The film has to get rolling. So if you could give a brief view from your perspective about what you think about this morning's launch. And then I know each of you have a few minutes of discussions, points prepared, and I welcome those as well. So we'll start with Dr. Park.
Okay, thank you very much. As you see, my mandate at the government at the moment is trade, and about launching the missiles or rockets, I don't have any idea what to say to you. Maybe Professor Chung can come in and respond to the audience on this. So if you allow me, let me say a few words from economic aspect for Korea-China relations, and maybe I can come in later if I can. But for your information, I just summarized a very brief statement for the audience. Korea-China economic relations have grown hugely during the last 20 years, especially since the two countries normalized diplomatic relations in 1992. If you look at the trade figures, to give you an example, bilateral trade volume, which was around $6 billion in 1992, has grown by more than 35 times, reaching $220 billion last year. This year, we are pretty much in the same kind of ballpark in terms of trade volume. China is now Korea's #1 trading partner, surpassing United States, Japan, and EU altogether. The bilateral trade volume accounts about 22% of Korea's total trade, with its export to China reaching more than 25% of Korea's total exports. Trade figures are a little bit different from Korean statistics and China's statistics because of Hong Kong and other aspects. There are more than 23,000 Korean companies operating in China. So far, most of Korea's export to China were to Korean subsidiaries by their parent companies. For example, in 2011, about 57% of Korea's export to China consisted of capital goods and parts exported by parent company to their subsidiaries. Now, considering that the Chinese government focuses more on domestic demand, calls for an FTA between Korea and China rise, particularly from the Korean business community. With this background, the two governments started the bilateral FTA negotiation on the second day of May this year. So far, 4 rounds of negotiations were held. We plan to have another one, the 5th one, in the late January next year. Probably this is the last negotiation under this government. In addition, trade ministers of Korea, China, Japan announced the launch of negotiations for a trilateral FTA in Cambodia last month. I don't know whether you saw the newspaper story. Also on the same day, ASEAN 10 nations and its 6 FTA partner countries, namely Korea, China, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and India, launched the negotiation for a regional trade agreement named the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. We call it now RCEP, RCEP. At the same time, as you know, negotiations for the TPP have been also going on among 11 countries led by the United States. From this, we can see that recently, bilateral FTAs tend to merge into larger regional trade agreements. I think this is a positive development for the multilateral trade system. Maybe this can provide the momentum to refocus on the multilateral trading system, although WTO DDA negotiations are still in very difficult situation. In Asia Pacific, right now, CJK, namely China, Japan, Korea, FTA, RCEP, and TPP are taking place in parallel. If they are progressing in the right direction based on the open regionalism principle, and also if Russia can join, we can actually achieve the so-called FTAAP, Free Trade Area of Asia Pacific, in the long run, which is the ultimate goal of the APEC. However, if the gap between RCEP and TPP is large, this long-term vision cannot be realized. In this context, it will be very important that RCEP aims at a relatively high standard and comprehensive RTA. To realize this goal, the CJK FTA is also very important. But before that, Korea-China should go for a relatively high quality and comprehensive FTA. In other words, China, the second largest trading nation in the world, and Korea, the 8th largest trading nation, should produce an FTA to become a model FTA in East Asia in the future. I will stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Paal. And he has also sort of opened the door so that you can we can come back to you afterwards with maybe a question about how you think today's activities will affect what you talked about as a very robust economic relationship between Korea and China. But for now, we'll go on to Dr. Vasily. Now,
So, Jie, I just want to check.
Yes.
Because your initial scenario was we first answer your question about this missile,
Mm-hmm.
and then everybody has a chance to present to colleagues our homework on
Yeah.
China-South Korea relations. But Dr.
did the
Park
homework
both.
Yes.
But
Yes,
so
he-
what do you want from me? First, answer your question and then had another chance to present my homework, or to follow Mr. Park's way, answer question and present homework at the same time? What's your choice?
I usually like people to answer my questions, so I would say answer the question first.
And then I will have another chance.
You will definitely get
Thank you
another
very much.
chance.
So we'll follow what you offered from the beginning. So today in the morning, I was drinking coffee and reading Korea Herald about that North Koreans postponed the missile test. And then I hear to CNN, 9:43 North Korea launched missile, and it fell down in the waters 300 kilometers east from the Philippines. And then just recently, only Americans said that the launch was successful, and the third part of the rocket successfully entered. Only Americans confirmed it. My position is, politically, it's violation of the UN resolutions. The problem is that Russian Deputy Foreign Minister responsible for Asia arrived yesterday and today in the morning. When they did it, they had consultations with your Deputy Foreign Minister here in Seoul. So, Russian position, my personal position, and the official Russian position, it's not announced yet, but it will be like that, I am sure. It's violation of the UN resolutions. So the act should be condemned. It's first. But second, I think that there will be discussion about how much successful the launch was. My point is that Americans overestimate the results of the launch, as usual, because they overestimate, exaggerate the so-called nuclear potential of North Korea. It's clear, it's understandable. It's to get more funding for missile defense system. So, my view, the launch was absolutely failed as usual. And you know why? Because the technology of North Korean, this ballistic missile, is based upon Russian Scud technology of the 60s for the small range missiles. This technology cannot be used for ballistic missiles, but there will be discussions.
Well, I appreciate that, especially coming from a Russian scholar. So, yes, I would actually take that into thing. But overall, though, I mean, they've had unsuccessful launches before, but still it has affected relations between North Korea and the rest of the country this time as well?
I'm sorry. I do not think it will spoil relations of North Korea with other countries, because they do not have good relations with anybody. But of course, it will be noise. Today already, South Korean and American administration demanded an extraordinary meeting of the Security Council of the United Nations just a few hours ago. And it will be another resolution which condemns North Korean violation of the previous resolution. But it will not affect much. If somebody wants to, like the United States, to increase sanctions, but in my view it's useless, because North Korea doesn't have big trade with or rest of the world besides of China, so only China can be useful in improving sanctions.
Well, Dr. Doug, as he would like, he did take a swipe at the U.S. perspective of the launch. What do you think?
Sorry?
Oh no, we've actually passed over, but you'll get your chance again.
You wanted
Promise.
me to answer about
Yes.
U.S. But
I don't think America's reaction to this or other launches has been driven by the industrial complex for budgets. They've got pretty good budgets as it is. Well, maybe it got loose when I fell over. Let's see if that's American.
도와주지. 도와주지.
Made in Japan.
Well, maybe we can move on to Dr. Pan. Before, are we getting?
Try now, is that audible? You have to turn it on maybe.
Oh, it sounds like. Uh-oh.
Are we, yeah, well, that
Oh,
sounds
yeah,
good.
that sounds much better.
The United States doesn't need, it's still not working? Okay,
It's the result of the launch. They interrupt the signal.
The U.S., I think, has a genuine and reasonable concern that North Korea will, on its own, be able to threaten its neighbors with its expanded nuclear and other missile capabilities.
I think
Still not working,
I think it may be the volume,
We can hear.
but
Already shooting. Yeah.
all right.
The U.S., I don't think, is responding to North Korean capabilities because we need a budget increase for our ABM systems. We are genuinely concerned that North Korea would be able to hold hostage its neighbors to their weapons of mass destruction, and there's at greater range with these missile capabilities, one, and two, there are proliferation concerns. There have been reports that are credible that Iranians were present to observe the launch, cooperation in missile technologies, and the sale of potential missiles to other of the small circle of people who take weapons from North Korea is a matter of concern to those countries' neighbors as well. So I think it's a genuine issue. I think from my perspective, having heard both here and in China recently from some serious observers who are Chinese, that there might be a change in the new leadership in China's view of how to deal with North Korea. This is a very, very early test of what may be the reaction. The test, because it's a military, quasi-military test at least, no longer a test, the launch, as I understand, NORAD has declared it a successful launch. That squarely falls on the desk of Xi Jinping, not the outgoing Hu Jintao. And therefore, his response will be an early test of whether or not Linda Jacobson's right that there'll be very little change, as she said here in the conference, or Mr. Tung is right, as he said, that there's likely to be some tougher response to North Korea. We'll know in a few days, I think. On the question of sanctions, I don't know whether there'll be a new Security Council resolution. There's an existing resolution, a presidential statement of the last spring, in which a commission was established to line up sanctions. That commission reported 40 entities in North Korea that might be sanctioned. In the bargaining that went on in the Security Council, only 3 were approved. So presumably there are 37 more entities that could be vulnerable to sanctions. How effective in the real world is another question, but 37 entities that could be sanctioned without even having a resolution in the course of the meetings at the UN Security Council. But from my perspective, as a signal of where China is going over the next 10 years, this is a very symbolically important moment.
Well, it naturally leads to you, General Pan. I mean, can you give us some insights about what he talked about? What do you think? I mean, there has been nothing coming from China yet, but China has traditionally been relatively lenient towards North Korea in these kind of situations. Do you see that changing or not?
Well, certainly this is the most unfortunate event. As far as I know, the Chinese government tried very hard to persuade North Koreans that it's in their best interest not to do that rather than do that. But unfortunately, they didn't listen, and they didn't listen also to the calls by the international community. So I agree with my colleagues that this kind of event certainly is a violation of the Security Council resolutions. And it's also kind of a challenge or defiance to the authority of the Security Council. So I guess that the Security Council must do something to show its authority and the seriousness of its resolutions. But on the other hand, I would like to offer my personal humble advice to people like here in this room. Don't make over response to this event. This is not the end of the world. Over response may just play into the hands of North Koreans. Maybe they just want this kind of response from the international world. See? So I could anticipate that they would raise a campaign of clamoring in the House, North Korea, a success. So I think that a cool kind of handle of this kind of issue would be better than just kind of a big noise, a big, strong response from the regional countries. And also sanction. I think that there might be some additional sanctions, but I don't think that would work any more effective than those previous sanctions. But to me, sanction is not important. What is more important is that we should be feeling even a sense of even greater urgency to try to start some kind of process of getting North Korea into negotiations. So it will be most unfortunate if this event serves to be a kind of occasion that we just shut up the window of opportunity, as I said, and try to find another alternative, to this multilateral regional efforts. So I guess that we should not be trying to deviate it from our path we see to solve that issue. Otherwise, I think that we perhaps would waste another few years, and let the situation drift. And I don't think it's in the interest of any country in the region.
General Pan, it seems to me that you're saying that we shouldn't look at this particular launch as really, as Doug pointed out, that it's the watershed of what the new leadership in China is going to do. It's not of that significance?
Well, I'm not so sure what you mean by leadership of China. I think that the Security Council certainly will discuss this, and will try to work out some kind of measures in response to this very provocative act. But my personal view is, if you exaggerate the implications of the event, and then we might just waste another kind of, as I said, that we lose another window of opportunity. And I don't like this kind of a saying which just help to, as I said, to close that window, and that will be most unfortunate.
Before we round off the North Korea issue for the time being, Dr. Park, do you want to have anything maybe to add about, will this have any type of effect on the sort of the trade and economic relationship that you talked about before?
I don't think so. I mean, among Korea, China, and even among Korea, Japan, China thing, I don't think North Korean event can have a big influence, although maybe some process could be a little bit delayed because of the government urgency for other, kind of policy measures, not directly affecting our economic negotiations.
And Dr. Vasily, as promised, we have come back.
To homework.
Yes, to your homework.
Yes.
So, and then you told me you had points that you needed to make about Korea and China.
Yes, Korea and
from
China.
your perspective.
Yes, a few points, if you don't mind. First point, there are two dimensions of China-South Korea relations. First, relations in regard to the North Korean issue, and second, economic cooperation aimed at creation of Northeast Asia and after that East Asia free trade area. And my main point is that the goal for two countries is to separate the development of these two dimensions in order that the North Korean issue does not impede strategically and globally important China-South Korean integration cooperation. My second point here, I will focus on the North Korean issue in the China-South Korea relations. In my view, the key to understand and forecast the issue is that first, China and South Korea have different approaches to the North Korean issue. But second, they have common strategic interests in turning North Korea into a normal market and open state. My third point is that the basis for common strategic interest is market democracy character of both China and South Korea strategic development, in despite of some specific things in China and South Korea political system. But the basis for different approach to North Korean issue is first historical. China was on the North Korean side in the Korean War. Second, political. South Korea is security ally to the United States. China is concerned that the growth of South Korean influence in North Korea will lead to growth of the American influence on the Korean peninsula. And in its turn, South Korea is concerned that growth of China influence in North Korea can impede in the future unification of the Korean peninsula. My strategic prediction is that common interests of China and South Korea based upon the economic security and integration co-development logic will become in the future stronger than differences of the historical and political origin. So my next point is the problem is how deep can be and should be China-South Korean cooperation on the North Korean issue. My answer is it should be enough to push peaceful regime change in North Korea in the direction of market transformation and openness. Democratization is the homework for the next stage. My fifth point, the problem is that North Korean regime, with a new leader or without him, is not interested in market transformation. In this, it sees risks for the ruling elite to lose their wealth privileges and political power. But this is not the only bad news. Another one is that even if North Korean elite decides to start reforms, it doesn't know what market reforms are. They do not have intellectual, bureaucratic, and economic cadres which could promote market reforms, even with the assistance from China and South Korea. My sixth point is the only way to achieve the goal is policy of total engagement of North Korea. What I mean? Total means not a conditional engagement as some American experts offer, but total engagement, because here I link this issue with your question about the launch of the rocket. The problem is not North Korean nuclear weapons and missile weapons per se. The problem is character of the North Korean regime. If the regime is changed, the issue of North Korea in the right way, the issue of North Korean nuclear and missile program will be solved. So conditional engagement is useless. But total means first, engagement of North Korean party cadres, bureaucracy, intellectuals, military, security, etc., intercultural, economic, and people-to-people exchanges in order to change psychological and knowledge climate of the North Korean society, similar to what the Americans did in regard to the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s. They engaged the Soviet Union in contacts, cooperation, and infiltrated an idea that the Soviet communist system is doomed. Finally, it worked. Now we enjoy market democracy in our country. And by this, by this psychological and knowledge climate changes to prepare for the regime change in North Korea. Second, total engagement means participation of all the 6 party talks members in the process. China and South Korea have both much bigger interests and much bigger opportunities to promote total engagement policy rather than United States, Japan, or Russia. Finally, China-South Korea cooperation on total engagement of North Korea is inevitable. It doesn't matter whether authorities in Beijing and Seoul think in this way or do not think in this way. And it doesn't matter who takes power in both countries. Personalities on the top can make the process faster or slow down for a while, but not to turn it back. I try to joke at the end. I'm not sure I will be successful, but I think that Gangnam style music is very popular now all over the world, as well in China. But I think that Chunghan style cooperation in regard to North Korea will be successful.
On that,
Thank you.
yes, thank you. And on that note, I haven't given you a chance to grace us with your homework, as Dr. Vasily talked about. If there are points you would like to make, this is your chance.
This is my moment, yeah. I really would like to thank Dr. Chung and my good friend Ham Chae-bong for the invitation by Asan to take part in this conference and to see so many good friends and to make some new friends in this context. I think it's been an excellent meeting. There's a phrase that's familiar to some of the older people here that you don't hear so much anymore about. It was a Cold War staple, correlation of forces. How are the powers of the Soviet bloc and NATO bloc arrayed against each other? I'd like to bring that concept back to life a little bit today to talk about how I see the region here and within that Korean relations with China. I think the correlation of forces in this region is really quite positive despite the news we have today. It's very positive in particular for South Korea. Today we have a China which is a strong country, but a country with a strong and enduring market. And it has investment opportunities for Korea. The rise of the Chinese middle class, now 300 million people, is the largest single middle class market in the world. Been tremendous opportunities for Korea that have been exploited, and we've heard from Minister Park about the plans to do even more. China has the promise of being, as I say, an enduring market, but I don't think it has the likelihood of becoming a kind of market hegemon. It's competing in the open world. It's not going to be something which captures you to the point where you lose some sense of independence. In the case of your relationship with the United States, I think that the U.S. is headed for economic recovery, slower than we'd like, but at a good, steady pace. In terms of the security, diplomatic, and free trade agenda in this part of the world, there's a bipartisan American commitment that's been forged over the last few years to support the rebalancing, which is what it's called in general, but it's a re-engagement in the region, which I think is very healthy and, again, is likely to be enduring. The alliance structure that's been established between the United States and Japan, Korea, and others in the region provides public goods that have, over the last 6 decades, provided peace and prosperity for the region and has every likelihood of continuing. As I say, we have a bipartisan commitment to provide those public goods in cooperation with our partners and allies. And in South Korea, you have an economy that's benefiting from the post-1998 willingness to really address reforms, to shake out the economy and restructure it. And it's paired with a democracy that I think is really quite mature and solid. We've seen elections this year I was in Taiwan for their election, after years of turbulent elections, they had a very smooth acceptance by the public of the outcome. And I think we have every reason to believe that's going to be the same here in the next week in South Korea. Regional integration is advancing the economic situation quite solidly, and even though the political and security architecture of a regional nature is not developing as rapidly as the economy, I've got a lot of confidence the economy is going to pull it along, that people will be, even despite our discussions here about the very many Cold War-like symptoms that people are spotting and the recurrent bouts of nationalism. I think the economies are so strong and the results are so beneficial that will help get us through it. The long-term relationship with China has an important variable, and that is the division of the peninsula under an unstable regime in the north. This is something that needs addressing. Beijing and Seoul try not to discuss the crazy ant in the attic when they meet. That's understandable. But this ultimately cannot be avoided. There has to be some mutual understanding of the long-term, hard-to-resolve existence of North Korea in the midst of the relationship between the two. To manage the North and to prosper bilateral ties, the South needs, I think, to proceed as it has done in very close coordination with the United States. We're about to see a transition here of either a major or minor sort. It's going to take some time. In the United States, we have some months of adjustment of personnel, but in a reasonably short time frame, 5-6 months, we really ought to sit down and have some very close consultation and coordination about how we want to proceed respectively, Seoul and Washington, with Beijing. And if we get Beijing right, working on North Korea will have a much better chance of success. China inevitably holds contradictory views of Seoul being both a cat's paw for the United States and an object of its efforts to separate the U.S. and South Korea from one another to reduce the impact of our cumulative efforts. Excuse me. Any strategy to add stability to relations with Beijing by Seoul requires creating the kind of crisis management tools that will help us to survive the crazy ant in the attic and the kinds of provocations that we will see. Necessarily, I think that any kind of crisis management mechanism is not going to start with Seoul talking to Beijing. It's going to have to be Washington and Beijing reaching some understandings about the limits of what we can tolerate and the limits of what we will do. We haven't had a conversation like that between the United States and China since the early 1970s. I think the moment is ripe for just such a conversation. Return to not the words, but the symbolism of the Nixon-Joe meetings, where the two sides were able to establish a framework that gives them some confidence. The issue for me is that we see competitive capabilities developing in our military and security apparatuses in the United States and China. And despite the honeyed words that emerged from every bilateral summit and some multilateral meetings, that grinding competition continues. And if we're not careful, it will take the lead, and the words won't be able to keep up with it. It's time for the leaders to seize the moment, seize this correlation of forces, to send a message to our respective defense establishments that those defense capabilities have to be put in service of an important policy objective. And part of that is to make a sustainable and peaceful relationship between the major parties in this part of the world. If that can be done, then Seoul will then have the room to proceed on its own to try to establish that kind of complementary relationship with Beijing. The time is good. Obama is confident coming out of his election. I think that new Chairman Xi Jinping exudes a confidence that I think will last. Some in the new Chinese leadership may be even more forthcoming on issues of very important concern to the Korean Peninsula than have been Hu Jintao and Dai Bingguo. Dai Bingguo, after all, came from the system that ran relations with North Korea. He was very involved in North Korea, and I understand he was often very protective of North Korea. China's interests have not changed. Personnel change may make no difference, but we ought to be together at the appropriate moment, probing to see whether people do make a difference in the way China approaches its enduring interests. We all know that there's been a lot of dissatisfaction in many circles in China with the current approach and the kind of results that China is getting. Please note that so far I have not said that we need to reach an agreement with or a solution on North Korea itself, on nukes or on missiles. I may not agree with General Paal about a window of opportunity being available to us. We saw on the February 29 agreement where the Obama administration reached out for, by my count, the fourth time to try to come to some agreement with the North Koreans about providing food for cessation of missile tests, that it was a failure. I can't imagine the administration would want to run to Congress and explain why it was going to do so again.
Excuse me, the North Koreans kept telling us that they notified the Americans when they discussed about this so-called memorandum. Is that true or not?
There are different views. The negotiator himself has said repeatedly, American negotiator has said repeatedly that he was not notified. I know Chinese have heard this. I don't know what the authority of...
We were told by North Koreans.
The North Koreans. Well, there you have it. Maybe you could check your source. Yeah. I think it'd be an enormous step forward if Washington, Seoul, and Beijing can ultimately agree on a package of measures such as were discussed earlier today, a big carrot and a big stick. That's going to be hard to do. What I'm thinking of is a minimum set of, as I said earlier, a minimum set of assurances to each other of what our limits are and what our bottom line is. And hopefully in doing that we can come up with a means of reducing the prospects for real misinterpretation between the two sides. I can tell you that in some exercises that I've been involved in where we have Chinese and others in the room and Americans, when we Americans postulate a move in a hypothetical situation in this region, we thought we were sending a peace signal. We'd move our ships beyond Japanese archipelago and therefore we'd be farther away from the crisis. But Chinese, watching that move, said, you're actually moving to a safe place to launch your attacks. And so we've really misunderstood each other. I raise this as an example of how fundamentally our vocabulary is not the same. And the only way we can build a common vocabulary is through a lot more interaction, conversation, so-called mill-to-mill dialogue. And it's a long way to go.
Maybe you could...
Yes, I'm happy.
Yes.
And a related aspect of a strong Korean status in the new balance of power environment in this part of the world is the potential for developing the lateral alliance structure. And it's not tenable for Japan and Korea to be where they are now for the long term if we're going to get the full benefit of Korea's relationships with China. And it's going to take work, obviously, in Seoul and Tokyo to get past that. This will require the two governments to realize the disadvantages of stressing the negative aspects of their relations and to begin again at shelving those issues that need to be shelved and creating a broader basis for cooperation. Again, despite the many thoughts that have been expressed in our forum this week that focus on the potential for trouble, I remain broadly optimistic that the situation is one to be seized. Thank you.
General Pan, you have the last word. You can address any of the issues that were brought up by our very panelists, or you would just like to bring up some issues of your own.
Thank you, Chairperson. I think that the bilateral relationship between China and South Korea has really been remarkable for the past 20 years since the establishment of our diplomatic relations. I try to think of any other bilateral relationship which could have seen so fast and so stable that these relationships have been for the past 20 years. And I think that this bilateral relationship indeed could provide a kind of really a good example in international relations. Particularly, you see, these two countries have different values and different political systems. And now, not only as Ambassador Park just briefed us, such kind of enormous kind of economic stake that two countries have together. But also, I think the two countries also worked well for security, for political cooperations. So if we look into the future, another 20 years, I don't have any reasons to be pessimistic. I think that we still have a very bright prospect that the two countries could act as just a kind of what we call a full strategic partnership. But of course, it does not suggest that we do not have problems. We have new challenges. Chiefly because the strategic context in which these two countries are located are different now. And China is no longer the China 20 years ago. And I guess that South Korea is the same. So we've got to try to do something to put these two countries in a new strategic setting, but continuing with kind of a dynamics for the future development. I could give you a long list of how we should overcome the challenges that we are faced with. But I try to pick up just a few, three, just an example as I see it as the most perhaps compelling that we will have to address. Now, first of all, economic relations. I think that as Ambassador Park said, for all these impressive achievements in our economic and trade interactions, I think that now we perhaps will have to do something more to maintain this kind of economic dynamics. And particularly, if we are able to create a more open, a more reasonable kind of environment in which that we could do the business. FTA, I think that's one of the perhaps priorities. Technology transfer, investment from both sides to the other side. These are, I think that's some very urgent tasks that the two countries must address. But I do not want to elaborate. Ambassador Park has more expertise on these matters than I am. The second area, the security area, people have been talking a lot. Now, to me, it could come down to a question how the two countries, China and South Korea, should try to better manage the issue of the role of a third country to our bilateral relationship. On the part of China, I think the challenge is how we deal with the two Koreas. Not let our relations with North Korea in a way of our relations with South Korea. I think that it's quite clear in terms of the content, the scope. China's relations with South Korea are far weightier than our relations with North Korea. So we have not only such a kind of enormous kind of trade and business investment and stake in each other. We also, I think that we collaborate very well on regional security and even on world security. So of course China would attach great importance to our relations with South Korea. And I can tell you during our discussion at home, I could perceive a kind of very great expectations on the part of the Chinese that the South Korea could play a central role in pushing forward the regional cooperation in Northeast Asia, in creating a kind of security architecture in future. And we like the central role of South Korea because we think South Korea has a unique position to play that role. You have good relations with almost all the other major players, and you have a unique relationship with North Korea. You are of the same nation. So I think that provided, as long as South Korea continues to pursue a foreign and security policy which aimed at maintaining friendship and trust with all the other major powers, and also with North Korea. And I think that China would support South Korea's that kind of role. But of course, having said that, we do not believe that our good ties with North Korea would affect our relations with South Korea. And in our perspective, our good relations with North Korea would contribute to the peace and stability of the peninsula. And try to imagine if we side with South Korea, whatever South Korea does, what will be the implication? I think that you will be closer to a military conflict. A military conflict in the peninsula, again, will be in nobody's interest, particularly not in the interest of South Korea. So that's why, quite bluntly, I would say the Chinese are not very happy about President Li Minback's policy towards the North, aiming at pressurizing, showing military muscles and so on and so forth. We don't think that's going to be very helpful. So it's just waste of 5 years. Now we have just finished a square, a kind of circle, and now we are starting to say how we reopen the policy towards the North. So I think that this is a kind of situation for China, for the two Koreas. And we know sometimes we are in a very difficult situation when the North and the South are in such a kind of bad terms with each other. So the only way out for China is when North and the South come to terms. And when you seek political reconciliation, I think China will feel much relieved and feel much comfortable. And I think that's the way that the Chinese do. We try to encourage getting together. You take more responsibility in helping North Korea. And you will be, as I said in the morning, you will be more than happy that you take the role of China to help North Korea. It is South Korea who should take the chief responsibility to help North Korea, not China. And then I think that you really build up a kind of political basis for peaceful unification. I don't think South Korea will become a really significant world power without solution of your relations with North. On the part of South Korea, I think China's concern is your relations with the United States. To us, Many Chinese feel that South Korea seems to with 2 feet in a separate 2 boats. On economic matters, you rely on China. On security, you depend on the United States. But I don't think that this kind of pattern will be sustained. You said you do not take sides, but South Korea has taken sides already, particularly on security. And South Korea keep telling us that your security alliance with the United States will be in no way aimed at China. It's only for the North. I tend to believe the sincerity of South Koreans, but I question your capability to resist the intention of the United States. Because the intention of the United States for the role of a military and security alliance is not only for North. It's just a link of the United States security policy in Asia Pacific. So look at what you have been doing. What the United States encouraging a kind of a re-network of a security alliance in this region together. China, United States, South Korea, and Japan. So when things come from push to shove, I question the capability of the South Korea to resist this kind of a strategic intention of the United States. I'm not saying that South Korea should be allied with China against the United States. I'm just saying that the security alliance in this region would increasingly be irrelevant to the security of all the countries concerned. And the third area, I think that we also should be encouraged to address, and that is both countries should work hard to foster a more propitious domestic environment for our better ties. Strangely, despite a kind of so intimate contact between our two countries, I don't perceive a very good public opinion in both countries towards each other. Media, think tanks may play a role in that. I don't know why, but this is a fact. So I guess that both our two countries really should work hard, particularly to encourage a kind of contact of the younger generations. I think it is the younger generation that will matter in the better ties between our two countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, I know that with this vibrant discussion that we're having on the floor, that those of you are just dying to ask questions. I'm going to leave what time we have for questions from the floor. We have almost 15 minutes, so but we don't have that much time. So if you have a question, you need to raise your hand quickly. I have 1, 2, so we'll just start with the 2 here and then work our way up.
Thank you. Don't you think China is also responsible for the launching missiles? You said we should be very, cautious and that we should not react overly to that kind of event. But we've been worried for a long time. It happened. North Korea declared, this year as accomplishing the powerful and prosperous country to be that kind of country. So North Korea got it. But we couldn't do anything. From your viewpoint, South Korea is responsible. We are the same people, but they kept challenging us. And the United States failed, no fault line, no red line. And China also failed. Your appeasement or your lukewarm or lenient policy didn't work. You spared the rest. You spoiled the kid, really. So you're going to keep that way? Thank you.
Yes. If you could identify yourself as you're asking the question yourself. Yes. Yes. And we'll just take two questions and then answer both at once.
Choi Sang with the Asan Institute. Two quick questions for General Pan. First, we've talked a lot about the need for new great power thinking, and I've been thinking a lot about your comment in terms of Korea having essentially separate primary security and economic partners. Historically, that's not really the case. But I guess my question is, in the modern era with globalization, do we need new thinking on these types of issues, that perhaps the way the world works today, it's much more complex, and that we can't expect the security and the economic side to totally line up? So I'd be interested on your thoughts on that. The other question would be I've been here in South Korea for 4 months doing research on basically Korea's emerging role as a global power. The one thing that always comes up in the background of that is the role of China. So I guess my question to you would be how do you see China and Korea cooperating on the global stage together, and do you see that as a viable possibility going forward? Thank you.
Since both questions are for General Pan, if there's one more question for General Pan, I'll just take three and then have him answer all three at once. Is there one more at the very end? Yes.
Yes, I'll ask a question to General Pan, but also to our South Korean colleagues. I'm Ralph Casa from the Pacific Forum in Honolulu. I'm a little concerned or confused by some of your analogies. I mean, South Korea is not economically dependent on China. China is a major trading partner with South Korea. So is the United States. So is Japan. So are many other countries. Economics isn't someplace where you become reliant on one and you forget about all the others. And that's a two-way street. So I think this, security is U.S. and economics is China is sort of a false comparison. It also seems to me that you have forgotten China's role in the Korean War and China's role in separating North and South Korea. When the Chinese vice president then, and now general secretary and soon to be president, in his official capacity visits a cemetery in North Korea, as Xi Jinping did 2 years ago, and praises the sacrifice of the North Koreans and the Chinese People's Liberation Army for liberating the Korean peninsula, you should not be surprised that there are some Koreans that still feel that there may be some animosity toward China. It's confusing to me. I would ask the question perhaps impolitely to our South Korean colleagues. Why is it that 100 apologies from Japan is not enough, but there's never been a request for an apology from China for its role in dividing the peninsula? There seems to be sort of a dual standard there. And I think when General Pan starts lecturing our South Korean colleagues on things, he should try to remember that other part of history that some Chinese seem to try to forget. Thank you.
Well, I'll give General Pan the first opportunity to answer the questions.
I try to respond first with Ralph Cosa and many other colleagues. So, Ralph, don't open the debate on the origin of the Korean War. I think that we can have another workshop on that. And from Chinese perspective, it was a civil war in the peninsula. And just like the civil war in China, the United States invaded and all the way to the Yellow River and even bombed our territory. So that's where we get involved. And when the war was suspended in 1953, in 1954, there was a Geneva conference to try to solve the Korean issue. And the Chinese troops withdraw as we promised. And the Americans remained in the peninsula even today. Of course, you had a kind of treaty with South Korea. So we think that's purely the product of the Cold War. why Korea was divided, not Japan was divided, you see, as a result of the Second World War. So I guess that's all. If you said that the Koreans still have some grudges against the Chinese, and I can tell you many Chinese still have grudges against Americans. But I think that if we are embroiled with this kind of pointing finger to each other in the Cold War years, there will be no end to that. So I think that a serious researcher should lead opinion to look forward rather than look back. Otherwise, I think that we will hopefully be engaged in the kind of debate that will be an end to that. And yes, I may use a phrase better to describe our economic relations. That South Korea and China have been so interdependent on each other, that we simply cannot say goodbye to each other. See, it's not only South Korea depend on China's economy, but it's also China's economy also, I think that you hope very much a kind of contribution by the Korean economic force, the companies. So this is a kind of interdependence you cannot deny. And there I heard some kind of figures. If the Chinese GDP growth rate dropped 1%, and South Korean economy GDP would simultaneously drop by 0.6%. So this is the data from the IMF. So you see how closely that the two economies have been connected. So it is in this sense I said that two countries are so much interdependent. Or to put it another way, South Korea depends on China's continuing growth and the vice versa. And it's beyond the China-South Korea relations. I think that China's rise is a process. I think that we are still struggling, try to develop ourselves. And just as our Party Congress report indicates, that will continue. Even we redouble our GDP within 5 years, we think that we're still at the primary stage of socialism. We're still a developing country. Or in our perception in the research community, China continues to be a regional power with some global influence. So I guess that our focus will continue to be on the Asia Pacific. I think that's the area that matters so much, you see, to our objective for seeing the stability and the peace, you see, in the region. And for the global role, yes, I think that we recognize with our development, China certainly would have expanding responsibility to contribute to peace and stability of the region as well as to the world. But definitely, I think China has a different approach towards global governance. Why we are opposed to a kind of a way of our Western countries deal with Syria, deal with Libya, because we have a different kind of philosophy for the world governance. Now, I hope that I would like to draw attention to one phrase I found in the Party Congress report. It did not appear before many years. That is, we, the Chinese, are opposed to the new interventionism. I would read it as a kind of way of the Western countries dealing with Libya, dealing with Syria. Now, just give you an example. I just read a report just 2 days ago here in Seoul, and that is Qatar. It has sold arms to the rebels in Libya after backed up by the United States. And now, much of these equipment and weapons now proliferate to the hands of the Islamic extremists. So this is a kind of unintended consequence, I think, even the United States doesn't like. And now, Syria. Now you find that among the rebels, and one of the most important part of the rebels actually has a close connection with Al-Qaeda. So the United States now is now in a dilemma. You see, it supports the rebels, but it does not support the Islamic extremists. I'm sorry, I will
it's
stop
okay.
here.
General Pan, as is fitting for our forum, we have ended with a very hot, started with North Korea and ended with a very hot China topic. I know that you have a lot more questions to ask. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We have a dinner to go to, which is not here. So we'll close this session. Again, thank you all so much for attending a session that combined our venue, Korea, with our subject, China. And as you've seen, all the discussions and all the deep kind of relationships that we have between the two countries point to a very bright future ahead. So thank you again, and I hope you had a wonderful 2-day conference. Thank you.